Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the Gen Z Jews Learning from Leaders series. In this series, I am interviewing national leaders on the topics of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today, our guest is Mark Weitzman. Mr. Weitzman is the Director of Government Affairs at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He is also the Chief Representative of the Center to the United Nations in New York. He was also crucial in writing the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, or the IHRA definition, which is gaining worldwide support. Mr. Weitzman, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, could you just tell Gen Z a little bit about your role as the Director of Government Affairs?
Well, would like to begin with just a few words about the organization that I work for, or at least the person that is named after, because I don't know if so many people remember him today, which is kind of, I'm sorry that that's the case. Simon Wiesenthal, who my institution is named after, was an Eastern European Jew who was caught up in the events of the Holocaust, lost around 89 members of his immediate family, including his mother and all sorts of close relations, went through a series of Nazi death and concentration camps, and was finally liberated by the American Army from Mauthausen in 1945. He had trained as an architect, and during the period while he was in the camp, he first began to try to use his talents as an architect. Those days, architects did all their architectural drawing by hand. They didn't have any, sort of technology to help them with it. And so he had a good hand, and he drew well. And he began to, when he could find a scrap of paper or some chalk or a nub of something, he would kind of draw a picture of what he saw going on there. He had some of those pictures that he managed to keep till the end of the war. And when he was liberated, he approached the Americans and offered his assistance in the beginning of, bringing Nazis to trial. He weighed about, I don't know, you've seen those pictures of survivors who came out of the camps, emaciated and looking like, walking skeletons. And the Americans looked at him and basically laughed him out of it. But he came back the next day with a list that he had drawn up from interviewing other prisoners that you can still find in the National Archives, which was the first list of Nazi war criminals that was around. I've seen it in the archives in my research there. And they took him to his commanding officer, and eventually, by the way, he became friends with the Army officer who was a non-Jew from Defiance, Ohio, who had liberated him, a colonel. And they maintained the friendship till the end of their lives, basically. But he decided to devote himself to tracking down the people who committed those crimes, making sure the memory of what happened during the Holocaust would never be lost, and to making sure that it never repeated with Jews or anybody else. So he devoted the rest of his life to those three goals: becoming a known human rights advocate for the Roman Sinti, the so-called Gypsy people, who were also murdered in the Holocaust, for Cambodians under Pol Pot, for Soviet dissidents, and so on. And about 40 years ago, a group of North Americans, realizing he did this all as an individual, he never had any organization, he was just working himself out of an office in Vienna, decided to try to carry on his work and work with him. And that became my institution. So we're a human rights or Jewish human rights organization, but we're rooted in the Holocaust and are obviously a great focus on anti-Semitism, but with a sense of the wider world as well, not limiting it to just, one focus or one people. I had the privilege of knowing Simon Wiesenthal very well and until his death. And he was just a remarkable human being. He kept his core of humanity throughout all the period that I knew him, and devoted the rest of his life, as I said, to this work. So in doing that, this institution now that I work for is based in Los Angeles. We have a Museum of Tolerance, which is our educational arm. And again, it deals with wide-ranging issues, not just anti-Semitism, wide-ranging issues devoted to tolerance. But we have offices internationally in Paris and Buenos Aires and Toronto and Jerusalem and so on. But my job is to represent us in intergovernmental affairs, meaning in the State Department or Congress in Washington, with the United Nations in New York, with some groups such as the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a kind of 57 country, I'll say mini UN to make it simple, but based in Europe with the European Association, and this IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So my work involves a lot of work with diplomats and governments, but I also direct part of our research arm, which deals with particularly with current issues of extremism and anti-Semitism. And I do that and do my own research and publishing, scholarly articles on anti-Semitism and material on anti-Semitism as well. So that hopefully is not too long an answer for you.
So why do you think, like, in today's world, the IHRA definition is so important and needs to be adopted at this time?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background for it first. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism was actually not written by IHRA, so let me just make a quick correction there. But it was floating around. It had been around for about a decade or so and had no formal status, meaning no group had ever formally adopted it or anything like that. It was put together by a group of Jewish activists and academics. There's some non-Jews also, I'm not even sure about that. When I was looking for something to introduce to IHRA around 2013, 2014, I picked up that one because it was, again, we were sort of, particularly in Europe, going through a crisis period of growing anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism, and this was coming on the heels of an earlier definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, and that one I was the lead writer, lead author of, which IHRA had adopted in 2013, fall 2013. That took 5 years to get through all the political negotiations and getting the support for it in this international body of approximately 30 countries. And I didn't want to take, given what was going on in Europe, I did not want to take another 5 years, honestly, to go through that whole process of drafting something from scratch. So we took this one. It took us a good 3-4 years to get it through anyway. But the reason that it became so imperative to do it, there were two reasons. One is that I mentioned that IHRA is an international body. You have delegates there from approximately 30 countries, ranging from the Baltics and the Balkans and North America and South America, even the UK and France and the countries where the Holocaust happened, and Israel and so on. So you have people from different cultures and different backgrounds coming together. But also, even though it's an intergovernmental organization, but the delegations are headed by a high-ranking senior diplomat, but they also have experts who are drawn from the field of study of the Holocaust, academic study, or educators working on Holocaust and related issues, or people who staff museums and memorials. As you'll find out when if you haven't found that already, each of those kind of groups has their own language. So you had, diplomats who may have known nothing about the subject, but still had the final decision. You had academics who are very detail-oriented in a certain specific way, but speak a kind of arcane language that, to most people. You have educators who have a whole different set of priorities and approaches. And then you have the museum and memorial staff. Plus, you may have had members of NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations, or communal civil society kind of people. And so we're sitting around the table trying to deal with these topics, and I needed to guarantee that we all were on the same page. You can't talk about fighting anti-Semitism if the 10 people around the table all have different views of what anti-Semitism is. Mm-hmm. And then the classic example that I use all the time came literally from the summer of 2014, which was one of the times that there was an outbreak in Gaza. And as a result of that, there were a lot of tensions, particularly, around the world, not just in Israel and so on. And there was a synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany, that literally was firebombed. 2 people took Molotov cocktails and threw it against the synagogue. This was a synagogue that was destroyed in Kristallnacht in 1938, rebuilt, fortunately with a large security, very, strong security walls. The damage, the walls were scorched, but the synagogue was undamaged, and the people inside were undamaged. They arrested 2 people who confessed to it. They were Middle Eastern origin, as it's described. But a German court, and then was upheld by an appeals court, said that this was just a political protest. It wasn't a hate crime. And the idea that you could go around firebombing a synagogue just because you didn't like something in a small place in Germany, which had no connection with what was happening in the Middle East, just because the people, it was a Jewish building with Jews in it, and that it's not a hate crime, it just showed how important it was to make people understand what anti-Semitism really is. So that kind of is a classic illustration of it. And then if I flash forward to just this past month, there was the court decision in Paris. where the man who was arrested, and I think he confessed to killing a Jewish woman after shouting, again, radical Islamist slogans and anti-Semitic stuff, because he had smoked weed before the murder, was basically affirmed by Francis High's Court that they would not bring him to trial under those circumstances. And roughly the same time, they convicted a man for throwing a dog off the balcony and killing the dog. So it just shows that there are, all sorts of ways that anti-Semitism is still not understood properly. So IHRA, it's not an academic definition. I could do a seminar on, what anti-Semitism is in different perspectives, and historical and theological and sociological and economic and psychological and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it may be interesting to all of the 8 people, around or not, but, you could do it. I sat through and done stuff like that. But IHRA is meant to be something different. It's meant so that there's a guideline for people to recognize what anti-Semitism is and why it's a problem. So it's a short text of about 38, 39 words, followed by a paragraph that introduces about 11 examples. And the novelty of it is that it stresses, that introductory paragraph stresses that a lot of current stuff is focused on Israel. A lot of current anti-Semitism is focused on Israel. But we don't want to, and it says very clearly that criticism of Israel, like any other country, is totally acceptable. It's when you depart from that and you single out Israel in a way that you don't single out other countries, that raises questions. And it also says context matters. What is said, how it's said, who is saying it, that's all, different things that play into it. And then it gives a list of examples. Some of them are very traditional forms of anti-Semitism. Some of them, relate to people saying that Jews have more loyalty to Israel than they do to their own country that they live in. Some of it is very Israel-related, comparing, Israel to the Nazis, for example, and alleging that Israel is committing genocide is so absurdly false that it's coming from an anti-Semitic place. Mm-hmm. And some of it is traditional, the murder or calling for the murder of Jews for ideological or religious reasons, which goes back to, classical forms of Christian and other forms of European and Western anti-Semitism. So we try to encompass the examples as illustrations to help people go along with it. And as I said, it's meant really on a very practical level. It's called a non-legally binding. IHRA has no power, nor do we want the power to send people to prison for things they say. It doesn't even say the word BDS or Zionism, and it's very specific about concrete, about Israel, which is excuse me for 1 second. Which is an entity, a real entity, not a thought in someone's mind. And as such, it received amazing, as I said, it took a long time for it to get adopted through IHRA. And then after that, countries started adopting it on their own. We now have 30 countries that have adopted on their own. Hundreds of universities and cities. The world's largest Muslim association of imams has adopted it. The Church of England adopted it. So it's really got a lot of traction. And there's some people who criticize it as being too Israel-focused or being this or being that. But, it's really it's really very specific on what it is. It's a practical tool. It's not a scholarly or academic discussion. It's not a legal document. It's a practical tool that can be used for people who need a guideline and establishes a kind of an international baseline for what anti-Semitism is.
So, as we know, anti-Semitism is heavily increasing worldwide nowadays. And so, why do you really think that's the case?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if we even have the answer. We could talk about a number of factors. One, obviously, is that there's been, certainly in the United States, a sort of growth of extremist discourse that has kind of penetrated the mainstream in extreme populism. My training was as an historian, so I kind of look in the past and see if there are parallels or things that may give clues to where we stand now. reality is we had in the 1980s and 1990s violent attacks on Jews, including murders in the United States. But it didn't reach the level of what we saw in Pittsburgh, for example. It didn't reach the large frequency, and it didn't reach the mainstream, halls of Congress, for example, like it has in recent years. And that includes, by the way, not just the violent attacks for Charlottesville or things like that, but it includes people having good words to say about Louis Farrakhan, for example, and not denouncing his anti-Semitism. So it's a problem on both sides of the political divide. In Europe, we have a slightly different case where we have really an overwhelming kind of, again, I sort of divided a kind of intellectual anti-Semitism that's part of the traditional right-wing parties that has been there for years and, sort of been on the fringes. In some places, like in France with Marine Le Pen's party, it's become more popular or threatened to make big political inroads. But it draws on nationalist heritages. Poland, Hungary, France, places like that, certainly. You have something in a far left perspective, like Jeremy Corbyn's Labour, these take the Labour Party in a much more left wing, which is rooted in the strong critique of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, that veers into conspiracy theories and all sorts of Holocaust denial and things like that. And then you have a huge influx of Muslims who were never integrated into European society. And as a result, you have a lot of disaffection and anger particularly amongst younger Muslims, who in some cases have rejected, literally gone against their parents and the establishment Muslim society and embraced radical jihadism and Islamism. The people who went to join ISIS and so on, and are very often the ones who have been behind some of the most violent attacks, physical attacks and murderous attacks on European anti-Semitism and European anti-Semitism. So you have these all sort of, coalescing together. So you have, extreme right, extreme left, violence in Islam. You have people who, are coming from the right who, let's say, don't want to call out, radical Islamist stuff as anti-Semitic because they kind of agree with targeting Jews or, things like that, even if they're against Muslims on a large scale. And on top of it, you can't ignore the impact of social media because it's a channel of communication, of propaganda, of incitement. I mean, we saw it here with QAnon and these groups that, leading up to the January 6th events. Multiply that over and over and over again. ISIS and recruitment like that was done by social media, was done online. The shooters in Christchurch, in New Zealand went into the mosque there. The shooter in Pittsburgh, live stream on camera and so on. There is a huge connection between social media and the growth of extremism in general, anti-Semitism, absolutely.
So what do you think is one action that Gen Z could do to get involved right now?
One action. I mean, I think you answered it. Get involved. And that takes different levels. Get involved can mean, keeping an eye on what's going on online. And if, you see some individual or some group, crossing the line, reporting them for, now Facebook and Twitter and so on, YouTube supposedly are cracking down on anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and things like that. Report them. Or bring it to the, attention of Jewish organizations or civil rights organizations. They don't have to be Jewish. We have a relationship with Facebook. We're on with them all the time. And sometimes, by the way, they just don't get it. I have a friend of mine who's a leader of a Jewish community, I'll say in Europe someplace, where there was a march commemorating the SS, the old, the SS, the Nuremberg trial court called them a criminal organization. They were the ones who really enacted the Nazi final solution, ran the concentration camps, did the murders, a lot of the murders and so on. And he got his Facebook page blocked, closed down, because he publicized this march to draw criticism against them and so on. And his was the one that was closed down. So we're trying to get that reversed right now. But there's, so that's one thing about it. But the other thing is that I think we have to demand accountability. And that's something you guys can help with as well. We have political leaders who are kind of pandering to the extremes. And it's not just in Washington, it's on local levels and so on and so forth. People have to get involved, and people have to demand more accountability and more responsibility from our political leadership than they've shown so far. And it's not enough, and this is the point that I keep hammering for the last, year or so, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, I can't think of how long. You can't use anti-Semitism as political football. You're in Washington. I know you know some family connections that know what's going on in Washington. One of the things that I always point out is one of the most heartening examples and positive examples is that in both houses of Congress, both the Senate and the House, there are task forces, bipartisan task forces to combat anti-Semitism, each led by Democrat and Republican, each having bipartisan membership. And these are people who, honestly, some of them would probably not agree with their colleagues on any other issue around. But this, they do. And that's great. And maybe that's a model. Because the thing is that to be successful at it, you can't make anti-Semitism political football and use it to point fingers at somebody else and say, I don't like you. You're progressive. You're, a neo-con populist or whatever, not a neo-con, but a populist or whatever. And so I'm going to accuse you of being anti-Semitic. You got to actually work on it in your own camp. If you're progressive, you got to basically say, we have people in our community, in our camp, that are doing things that are just unacceptable. The classic one was the Dyke March in Chicago a couple of years ago, which threw out people who wanted to march with a Jewish star. That's not acceptable. And at the same time, you can't go along and, give a pass to people who are, marching in Charlottesville, or who are, talking about space lasers and other things, and basically say that, well, it's okay, they're a member of our party, I don't agree with that, but we'll just glide over that one and let it go. You can't. You got to start with yourself. And that's the thing that I think, that kind of accountability, demanding that kind of accountability and responsibility, and looking at the positive model as well, are the directions that I hope that, that you guys push people to follow, and to, go in that direction. I think it's hugely helpful.
And to wrap us up, is there anything else that you would like to say to Gen Z?
No, just I applaud you guys immensely for being involved, for getting involved on this stuff and for caring about it. It's, we began talking earlier before we, started recording. That high school is a time where there's a huge amount of pressure to cram everything in, especially the dual curriculum and so on, to cram everything in 4 years and to take that next step and get that, step that you think is going to be the first rung on the ladder to your eventual career and future paths. And it's so hard sometimes to see beyond that. And I'm so impressed that you guys are doing that and willing to, take the time and think of larger issues. It's hugely important. And here I'll say, as someone who went through a Jewish day school as well, the education that you're getting, and I probably should have said this earlier, makes you special. Because to have a Jewish background is to understand that anti-Semitism is not the reason to be Jewish. The reason it's to be Jewish is because there's positive stuff in Judaism. However you end up defining Judaism and choosing it your own way, and so on, that you'll choose for yourself. But you'll now have the knowledge, and wherever you're going is, when people start talking about what Jews are or what Jews do, etc., you're going to have the knowledge to answer that. And soak up as much as you can of this opportunity, and just use it as a basis to keep building and growing in the future.
Well, Mr. Weitzman, thank you so much for coming on today.
Pleasure, and good luck with the future, and I look forward to hearing great things from you guys and to following in your footsteps down the road.
Well, thank you. Bye.